Good afternoon, good morning, good evening, depending on where you are. Thank you for being with us for this new session of the SAFI-UAE webinar series. This is our seventh session, and this will be the last session that is on a weekly schedule. And for this session, we're going to be having a slightly different format. What we're going to be doing is that we're going to be having a roundtable discussion that has to do with how we go about implementing a sustainable aviation fuel initiative, specifically here in the UAE. And so what we will be doing is, before I introduce our panelists, I'm going to go ahead and share with you a few slides that will, in essence, set the scene for this particular session. And then we will start the discussion. And so it will be a very interesting discussion that has to do with many different aspects. And so we hope that you enjoy this session. So give me 1 second. I will go ahead and share my screen. And let me see if that works. So again, we'll be talking about how do we go about implementing the Sustainable Aviation Fuels Initiative in the United Arab Emirates. And when we started this process, when we started this webinar series, we talked about a number of key elements that are very important when considering a sustainable aviation fuel industry and in general, how the UAE aligns along this strategic set of elements. And so we discussed that the UAE is a major player in world aviation, and there is no question about that. Even with the COVID-19 pandemic, we know that the UAE is a major player, and it will continue to be a major player in world aviation. We know also that there have been a number of strategic and important investments in the aviation industry in the UAE, and therefore aviation is a sector of strategic importance for the UAE. It's a significant part of its GDP, and it's a significant part of its overall economy. We also looked at the capacity that exists in the UAE for the production of energy in general, but very specifically for the production of low cost and low carbon energy. And that is a very important point when we start thinking about how we can produce sustainable aviation fuels in this region of the world. And because the UAE is such a big player, and because this is such a big part of its economy, the UAE needs a holistic strategy to address its carbon emissions from the aviation industry, specifically because the UAE is a signatory of the CORSIA market-based measure, the Carbon Offsetting and Reduction Scheme for International Aviation. And so because CORSIA is going to come into play, the UAE needs to have a strategy as to how it's going to approach this CORSIA implementation, and in more broad terms, the Paris Agreement and many other aspects of how to combat climate change and reduce our carbon footprint. And again, if we look at where the UAE is and the conditions that prevail here, we know that the UAE has a very limited set of opportunities or feedstocks from which to produce sustainable aviation fuels. And so we need a way of concentrating on those very few feedstocks and looking into whether or not it makes sense to produce sustainable aviation fuel here in the UAE. And so for that, we had originally, in the first session that we had, we essentially put a proposal forward. That proposal has its roots around 5 specific pillars. And those 5 pillars are nothing else but a proposal. We have a pillar that has to do with sustainability. We know that sustainability is very important in the SAF space. We have a pillar that has to do with technology, because technology, even though there's a lot of technologies that are to come for sure, there are a lot of technologies that are already out there and that are at commercial scale. And so we need to look into the different technology readiness levels that are out there and decide which are the ones that make the most sense to implement here. And then we have a policy pillar, because we understand and we've seen throughout the different sessions that policy is going to become a very important part of this entire endeavor. And so we also have an R&D pillar, because we know that R&D, when we look at these different pathways and these different technologies, some of them are going to be on the low end of the technology readiness level. And this is where R&D, research and development, is going to become a key aspect of this entire process. And then, of course, we can't forget about business development. And so, unless we really start creating the industry and building companies and building businesses around this idea of the production of sustainable aviation fuels, the industry is not going to exist. And so looking at those 5 pillars is the initial proposal. And we have, had this very interesting set of sessions where we have talked about different aspects in the sustainable aviation fuel space, from all the way from how these fuels are produced, what initiatives exist around the world, what people have been doing both at the global level, and then what the oil and gas industry has been doing around this particular space. What are the opportunities and essentially the elements that make it a viable industry here. And I don't want to, I'm not going to go into the details of each and every session, but I just wanted to put up there a few quotes that I thought that were very, very important to consider. Essentially, we have, in the first session, we had Robert Boyd from IATA, who said, just because there is a short-term crisis, it doesn't discard our long-term considerations. Environment is really a key pillar of aviation into the future. So we can't forget that environment is always going to be a key pillar for aviation. And then we had, in our second session, we had Jennifer Holmgren from LanzaTech, who said, I would ask that you consider a few things that will make the production of new fuels go faster. At the end of the day, what we need to do is scale up much more quickly. And so this is also a very important point. The SAF production has not been as fast or as scalable as one would have thought in the beginning, but we have to make sure that we start moving on this particular front much more quickly. Steve Sonka from Coffee in the United States essentially said, my recommendation is for any new entity to create structures and oversight that allow the function to be nimble, utilize public agency resources where they are available. So, this talks about an idea of having a private-public partnership to implement this initiative. We also had Mariam Musallam Al-Kubaisi from Etihad Airways, who said, if I look at the UAE as an example, we live in a very interesting region where things can happen. This is a place where things can move and move quickly. So then again, we have another very critical element that the UAE has made sure that every time the UAE comes ahead, because it actually happens here, and things are made to happen here. Again, and then we have other people from Avinor, an airport operator, that said new types of fuel on a much larger scale are needed, but it is very unlikely that the price for the buyer will ever fall below the price of conventional aviation fuel. So policy and incentives are needed. So again, this goes back to, some people mentioned mandates, some people mentioned other types of policies. So we need to look at what are the policies that make sense here in the UAE. And then, Stéphane Thion from Total said, down the road, we see power to liquids and electrofuels being also a great way to achieve the decarbonization of the aviation sector. But for that, we'll have to have a reduction both in CapEx and electricity costs. The thing is that here in the UAE, we already have quite a low price for electricity. And so we need to capitalize on that particular advantage that we have here in the UAE. And then, not last and not least, again, there were many very important things that have been said over the last 6 sessions, but John Hurst from the Emirates Water and Electricity Company said another key feature is the strong participation of the Abu Dhabi government in achieving low cost of energy for PV solar projects in Abu Dhabi. The UAE is very politically stable, and government-related entities owned 60% of these projects. So there are conditions here that essentially can reduce the risk of these large-scale investments that are needed to develop an industry such as sustainable aviation fuels. And so, again, we go back to this idea, to this proposal of looking at the implementation of sustainable aviation fuels from the perspective of these 5 pillars. In no particular order: business development, technology, policy, sustainability, and R&D. And so today we have with us a very important set of panelists. We have Lourdes Vega, who is the director of the Research and Innovation Center on CO2 and Hydrogen. She is a professor in the Chemical Engineering Department at Khalifa University of Science and Technology here in Abu Dhabi. We also have Manuel Kuhn, who is the Senior Vice President of Business Development for Siemens Middle East, based here in Abu Dhabi in the UAE. We also have Sergio Lopez, who is the Energy Policy Specialist Expert for the Department of Energy in Abu Dhabi. And we also have Shannon Scott, who is the Senior Manager for Environment Affairs at Emirates Airline. And so all of our experts are here because they all have a place in this proposal. We have an expert in sustainability, we have an expert in business development, we have an expert in policy, we have an expert in technology and Professor Lourdes, and also an expert in R&D. And so we will be discussing all of these different pillars. And so I would like to just very briefly ask each of our panelists to just, again, I have introduced you very quickly, but say something about yourselves quickly so that the audience knows who we are and who we have here today. And so let's start with you, Lourdes, please. Sorry. We can't hear you.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. So my name, sorry, this is the problems of the live. My name is Lourdes Vega, and I am a professor here in Abu Dhabi. And my area of expertise, or I have been working essentially in things related to sustainability, which is part of the SAF that we are talking about, focus on CO2 capture and utilizing the CO2, hydrogen production, and clean energy in general. So I think that fits nicely into the discussion we have today. I have been working in industry for several years, and I was leading the technology management team for CO2 and clean energy and water. And I have also been in academia for several years.
Thank you very much, Lourdes. Why don't we go ahead? I have here on a clockwise fashion. So please, Manuel, if you can go next, please.
Yeah, sure. Thank you, Alejandro. My name is Manuel Kuhn. I work for Siemens in the UAE since 6 years now, and the head of business development strategy. In Siemens, we have since April a dedicated unit that looks into hydrogen systems and power to X, and I represent this unit for Middle East and Africa. By trade, I'm actually an industrial engineer, so I like building up factories. This will become important in the rest of the discussion, I believe. Looking forward to sharing our opinions with you.
Thank you, Manuel. Sergio?
Thank you, Alejandro. My name is Sergio Lopez. I'm working in the Department of Energy. I came 1 year ago, more or less. Before I was Deputy Director for Hydrocarbon in the Spanish government. So I deal with biofuels and with regulatory mechanism in order to foster the penetration of renewables in the transport sector. And happy to be here. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sergio. And last but not least, Shannon.
Thanks very much, Alejandro. Hi, everyone. So my name is Shannon Scott, and I'm responsible for environmental affairs at Emirates Airline. I've been here in Dubai for 7 years, and the role in our department basically covers everything from international policy, international compliance with the EU ETS, etc., and corporate reporting, as well as internal sustainability initiatives. So before I was here in Dubai, I was with the New Zealand Civil Aviation Authority, working on environmental policy and air navigation policy, and also represented New Zealand on CAPE, the ICAO Civil Aviation, as the Committee on Aviation Environment Protection. And the last few years I've also been involved in the development of CORSIA through the UAE representation on the CAPE Committee.
Thank you very much, Shannon. And so I guess that will take us right into our discussion. And since we're going to be talking, and we have been talking about sustainable aviation fuels, I'd like to start with a question specifically for Shannon around sustainability. So the first question I had for you, Shannon, was we have seen that one of the key issues for sustainable aviation fuel to be successfully implemented is that they must be able to certify their sustainability. So what do you see as the major barriers to accomplishing this here in the UAE or in general?
Sure. I mean, that's quite a big question in many ways. So I think the whole area of sustainability certification, as far as aviation fuels goes, is still in development. There's an awful lot of very good work that's been done internationally. For example, Roundtable on Sustainable Biomaterials has their own program and has a fairly robust process now, and I gather there are other schemes as well underway. So I think if we were to look at setting up a process within the UAE, then it would have to choose obviously from the best practice that is out there internationally already. And obviously, there's some great learnings already that have been taken through the work in ICAO already, as well as these other groups. So I'd probably like to stress to you that from an airline point of view, the sustainability certification is really important, because we want to know that the fuel that we're purchasing is in fact obviously sustainable, but also we need to, like, for example, if we're going to be using it for CORSIA compliance, A, that it's compatible with the CORSIA requirements, and B, that we know what the life cycle emissions reductions are, so that we can report those emissions reductions, and so that all of our stakeholders can also have confidence that what we're reporting is definitely accurate. So there's a lot of interest for us as the operators in making sure we're also procuring fuels that have robust certification standards behind them.
Okay, thank you very much, Shannon. We'll move along, and now we're going to go into the technology space. And I guess this would be a question for Lourdes. The major barrier for many of the SAF or sustainable aviation fuel pathways is the cost of these alternative fuels. These conditions in the UAE seem to be just right to take on this challenge with plentiful and low carbon energy sources. From a technological point of view, what other barriers do you see for the development of the SAF industry in the UAE?
Thank you, Alejandro. I think, the stars can be aligned, but we need to help the stars to be aligned a little bit. So we have low cost energy that we say, beautiful renewable energy that we can use. So this can be used, for example, to produce a syngas. We can have hydrogen together with CO2, and from there we can produce the SAF. However, that requires several technologies to be together and at the same level. So one of the things we have to do, in my opinion, is to identify the technologies that will work in the UAE, knowing the feedstocks we have here that you have already mentioned, and implement them at the right scale so that we can combine them before further scaling up. So this is one of the things we have to do. And the other thing I think we have to do from the technology point of view is to put together these technology experts, okay? Because each of these technologies will have an isolated knowledge, let's say, but we need to have the whole picture. So we have to work together on linking. That's why I say we need to align the stars, and we have to help a little bit. So we need to put the experts to work on putting these technologies together for the in the end, the production and the exploitation of the SAF from here, from the UAE.
Thank you, Lourdes. I think that that is a key point here because, as you well point out, integrating the different, I see it as integrating different silos that in many cases,
Yes.
there's vertical integration, and that vertical integration is very, in many cases, very difficult to accomplish. And so we're talking here about vertical integration, but also horizontal integration between potentially different industries. And so this is where the complexity really lies in trying to produce these fuels. And so I completely agree with what you've pointed out. And so, let's look into how can we, in a way, try to facilitate or make the necessary conditions for this to happen. And so I would like to have a question for Sergio from the policy perspective. And that question would be, what types of policies, for example, feed-in tariffs or resource allocation or subsidies or mandates, there are many different types of policies. What types of policies do you think would have the most impact in the establishment of a SAF industry in the UAE?
Okay, thank you, Alejandro. I really think that policymakers should have an active role to promote safe industry. But the first step normally before talking about subsidies or resource allocation is to have a strategy that can provide stability and can provide visibility and commitment to attract investments and reduce the perception of risk. So once you have this strategy, then supporting policies can be considered from different points of view. We can consider supporting policies from the supply side because we understand that SAF requires capital to be put at risk, at least at the very early stage of this innovation chain. And to thrive this technology, governments may have to take on a proportion of this risk. So it can be done digitally, funding the projects or granting the projects, or through tax incentives, or through public-private partnership, for example. And on the demand side, there are different mechanisms. We have offtake agreements or low carbon fuel standards or blending mandates. So regarding offtake agreements, that's something that is under discussion nowadays in the European Commission, the possibility to create a kind of central auctioning mechanism where producers can bid at the lowest price to supply a volume of SAF during a certain period of time. And of course, it can give a little bit or quite degree of confidence to investors. Regarding the low carbon fuel standards, where a cap or on CO2 fuel emission is set, this mechanism is neutral from the technological point of view. So it does not stipulate with which fuel should be adopted. And finally, we have these blending mandates that we talk a lot about them, where the regulator set a share of SAF to be supplied. And what is good about those mandates is that they create a kind of a stability framework over a period of time, and of course it attracts investors. And also regulator can set different sub-objectives for specifically promote in a higher or lower degree the different SAF technologies. So we have different mechanisms, and governments should carefully analyze all of them and choose those that better fits with their strategy that should be approved in advance. But what is true is that in order to be effective, all of them should consider a couple of things. The first thing, and it's very important, is that they should provide certainty about the future demand. And that's very important. And they should avoid regulatory changes in the middle of the road. And secondly, any measures to be introduced should not create additional demand without ensuring that at the same time a growing supply is being created, because otherwise it will lead to an increase in price or to lower sustainability levels or whatever. It's important to be aware in any case that the sooner or later passengers will need to pay a little bit more for decarbonized aviation. And the challenge that we have is to incorporate the cost of decarbonizing this industry without destroying the benefits that aviation brings in terms of tourism or economic development. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sergio. That was quite a bit to digest, but thank you very much for that. I'm pretty sure that our co-panelists will have a few things to say along those lines, and we'll have a very interesting discussion because, you know, one of the points that you raised was, you know, the willingness of passengers to pay for SAF or for, I guess, offsetting their flight. And several airlines have been trying to do this, and in certain markets it really works. In Europe, you know, people don't blink an eye, and they pay for the $5 or $6 that it would take to offset their flight. But I was in a panel, I was moderating a session a few weeks back that there was a specific question, and it was full of, you know, people from government and from other, you know, all related to aviation, all interested in sustainability. And the question was, would you be willing essentially to pay for offsetting your flight? And most people said no. You know, the airline is responsible for offsetting those costs. And so if we ask Shannon, I'm pretty sure he'll have a very different viewpoint. But before we get into that discussion, let's move ahead and ask a question on the R&D piece, or before we go into R&D, let's go into the business development piece and ask Manuel a question. So, you know, many of our panelists in the past sessions have insisted in the need to essentially put steel on the ground now and not wait until the technologies are, in a way, ready. So how do you see the role of industry in supporting these types of efforts?
Yeah, thanks for the question. Yeah, I'm a big fan of putting steel on the ground too. The question is, what's the right size? And that directly connects to what Sergio said. We have to find out what is the right starting point today. I mean, we are as we're speaking, we are commissioning the first industry-sized hydrogen plant in Dubai, which was supposed to be ready for the expo. Now the expo is a bit later. We're a bit later, but we will be in time. So the odds are even again. And COVID didn't really help, but it's ongoing, and it's actually going quite well considering the circumstances. So now, if I have discussions on potential further projects, I wouldn't be so much interested in putting another pilot plant on the ground because we have one, and or soon we have one, and we are learning already a lot. So one of the tasks that the industry has is, besides developing the technology, we can touch this maybe a bit later, but gaining operational experience on these assets is incredibly important. And as we go ahead and everybody gets excited about the topic, the gap between what we believe we should do and what we can do, and what we actually have gained on operational experience in running such assets, the gap's getting bigger every day. And that's why the question is also back to what is the right next step. If you go too small, it's another pilot plant. It will have ridiculous costs. Yeah, you will not be willing to tell people what your actual production costs for a liter of kerosene are, because it will just make everybody shy away. If I go so big, that I generate enough scale effects that, based on, it was said before, I mean, electricity costs in the UAE are perfect, tick, yeah. Political stability, tick. CapEx on the electrolyzers, half tick, we're working on it, yeah, but it comes with the scale. So now we could go big, but how much risk do we really want to take in an environment where we have never put all the pieces together, as Lourdes said? So the question is, where's the sweet spot where we can allow for a significant industrial size, that also what we learn has a meaning for the next years to come, and still we have to be able to pay for it, and it should be from an output in a range where the airlines, national or international, are also able to consume what we produce, yeah? Because it will still come with a price tag, and so it question is who pays for it at the end. So for me, the biggest question right now is this triangulation of how far do we really want to go, and then get the financials right. So if we go too small, it's not a good example. If we go too big, nobody will take the risk. And where's the in between?
Okay, and yeah, I guess that the idea here, the central idea that you're espousing, is that we have to find the sweet spot. We have to find that right combination of factors that allows us to take that next significant step so that we can start producing something of value. And I couldn't agree more with what you have just said. Let's go and visit a question on the R&D front, and for that I would like Lourdes to chime in terms of how do you see the role of academia in helping the development of SAF in this region? And what do you see as the major barriers to drive this type of research forward? As you know, you are the director of the Research and Innovation Center for CO2 and Hydrogen. I am the director of the Sustainable Bioenergy Research Consortium. I'm sure that we can have a long discussion or a specific session on what types of barriers we face for creating the research that needs to happen. But if you can give me your quick 2 cents on what is the role of academia, what is the role of R&D in the development of a sustainable aviation fuel industry?
I think there is a double role, actually. On the one hand, usually breakthrough comes from the combination of working between academia and industry, and is usually on the academic side, probably because we are more crazy or we have less problem on risking than a company will do. I mean, I'm putting now my hat as a researcher in academia. And you can see, I mean, I explored the case of Lansatec, for example. I mean, they developed the technology with the PNNL. If you look at other technologies developed in Europe, are also with ATH. So there is always an academic reputed institution behind that will provide not only the part of the ideas, but also the laboratories in which you can explore at small scale what you are trying to accomplish later at a large scale. And these are the two pieces that I think the collaboration between public and private sectors can help. So in coming with breakthrough ideas, which, by the way, I think is clearly needed for this sector, because that will address the scale up, which is one of the limitations, and it's because of the feedstock. So we need to come with new ideas to change this and to really come to large production of this in a cost-effective and safe way. And the other one is using the laboratories and the complementary tools that we have in our labs for testing, instead of having a specific laboratory for something that we don't know if it's going to work in industry. And in the UAE in particular, we have these possibilities. I mean, we have Khalifa University that we are representing here today, which is one of the top universities in the area, in which we have core labs and other labs, but we are not the only ones. We also have other universities in the country.
Push for the use of hydrogen as an industrial fuel, and it certainly has a role to play in the development of sustainable aviation fuel in this region of the world. So from each of your perspectives, how do you see this push playing out, this renewed interest in hydrogen and what it can do as an industrial fuel on its own, but also as a component for sustainable aviation fuels. And let's go around, and perhaps let's start with you, Manuel, and then we'll do counterclockwise this time around.
So I see a tremendous increase in very serious discussions about green hydrogen, but I just want to stop here quickly and take the word green and ask, how serious are we? Yeah? Because if we think it through, and it goes back to the question again, would a passenger be willing to pay for it? So if we think it through, we have to be clear that what we create here is a different product, and with a different quality aspect, and the quality aspect is being green. And this product it's a different price. It's like I take gasoline or diesel. So there's another option. And we have to be clear about that this is a different product with an own market that will have its own market dynamics, which has its own price level. And especially this market is not established yet. So from my perspective, complete priority is on establishing this market mechanism, especially when we think beyond the UAE on bilateral trade, for example. We need to have the market for the green product, and whether this is now already jet fuel or like methanol or whatsoever, or the green hydrogen itself, no matter how you want to transport it, the market needs to be there. And this will answer us a lot of questions, especially also on when is the product really green? When is my hydrogen really green? If my electricity is green, tick. Does my water need to be green? Coming from RO with PV power, and so on and so forth. How green must the CO2 be that is in front of my synthesis plant? Yeah, can it be from an avoidable, non-avoidable source? Does it need to be direct air capture? I have an opinion about this, but there are lots of questions to actually say what are the properties of the product that we want to place in this market, and there we have still a lot of uncertainties. If we don't get them out of the system, we cannot go for big investments because nobody can release funding for such an unstable business case. So and that's a bit the path we have to follow through, and there to be realistic, I think that this will take a few years more than we all believe until we get to this market.
And therein the idea behind SAFI, right? The whole point behind SAFI is that we actually roll up our sleeves and start doing that work as a team, as an industry, as a number of stakeholders that have something to say. And so I think that you've hit a very important point there. But let's go and ask Lourdes, what do you think about this? I mean, about the question I asked, not we can.
About the role of hydrogen, you mean?
Yeah.
Okay, so I agree we need to create the market for hydrogen, but I think there is a market for hydrogen. What we have to do is to prioritize where do we want to put the hydrogen. Hydrogen is what it is. It's a very small molecule, but it has a lot of, it's a huge energy carrier. So we need to see, depending on where we produce the hydrogen and what we want to do with this hydrogen, how big the market would be. And by the way, I think one of the greatest markets would be SAF, if we know how to do it. Because then we are short of feedstock. But if we get the hydrogen from seawater, for example, we have plenty of seawater. Of course, there are many issues associated to that if we talk about the technology, but it's there. So the point is, building a hydrogen plant just for the sake of building a hydrogen plant is nice for showing it. But I think, I'm going back to what Sergio said before, we need to have a strategy. Hydrogen is great, and our center is on hydrogen. Hydrogen has many possibilities, but we need to pick up which ones are the ones that we want and which ones are the ones that we want for the UAE. And specifically on this, I think we can use hydrogen also for building more chemicals. And part of this is the syngas, and the syngas will now be related to energy, clean energy in general, and specifically can be used for SAF. So the links are there. We have to work a little bit more on how to do this. The beauty of hydrogen is that we can generate hydrogen. Now it's expensive, it will become cheaper. As long as we put more investment, we believe in that, and we have more. We have seen this with many technologies, so why not with hydrogen? Europe is putting billions of euros now on this, so why not? I mean, they have studied this to go to that strategy.
I think I see a lot of agreement in those two answers, actually. I couldn't agree more. I don't know about, going back to Manuel's comment about this green hydrogen. I'm on the camp of not coloring the hydrogen because then you start, especially here, because you're right. It depends on where the boundaries of your system are set and how you determine the life cycle assessment of the process or of the final fuel that you're actually producing. And so in our case, in the case of a sustainable aviation fuel, we need to draw boundaries as to where the hydrogen is coming from, and of course where the water is coming from, if we're going to be doing electrolysis of water to produce the hydrogen. But there are other ways in which we can produce hydrogen, which may reduce the carbon footprint or the carbon intensity of other fuels, and also create a low carbon opportunity for blue, gray, brown, however, again, whatever color of hydrogen we want to look at. Again, I think that the interest, and this is where I see the commonality, the interest is that we have a low carbon hydrogen and a market for it. And again, my position or my the whole suggestion is that aviation is the market, or could be the market for this. And this leads us to our next panelists in terms of your opinion, Shannon. What do you think about this whole hydrogen world?
Thanks, Alejandro. I'm glad you agree with my views on aviation being the perfect destination for hydrogen. Certainly that's our view. I totally accept that there's a lot of work still to go in terms of, I mean, the technology works. We know that you can put all the pieces together and it will make sustainable aviation fuel beautifully, but getting the right price is the key at the end of the day, and that's going to take a few more years yet. I thought was fascinating last week. So last week ICAO held a 4-day online stock taking seminar. Yeah. And one of the common themes right through this whole seminar was hydrogen. And so yeah, and it was different types of hydrogen too. It was everything from fuel cell based light aircraft through to hydrogen, liquid hydrogen based propulsion, through to e-fuels, power to liquid fuels. So the whole spectrum. And I thought was fascinating was the Russian CAPE members' presentation, and how they'd actually done liquid hydrogen powered jet aircraft in 1988. So the technology exists, it's just making it feasible. So I think actually we kind of come back around full circle to the policy point, which is probably going to be your next question to Sergio. And again, the European experience here is really interesting because of the thought and the considerations they've put into all different aspects of developing not just the hydrogen end of the picture, but the whole production chain right through to e-fuels or power to liquid fuels. And I think in common broadly with sustainable aviation fuels in general, as we've talked about many times before, aviation is limited in the types of energy sources it can tap into, at least for long-haul aviation. Now, in Emirates' case, we're a global international carrier, one of the largest in the world. We fly a fleet of A380s and 777s. Longest flight is over 16 hours. That within the next 20 years is not going to be replaced by electric aviation. It's going to be a push to even for, say, hybrid engines. So we're still talking about turbine fuels running on liquid kerosene. And so the question then comes back to, where does that kerosene come from? What's it made from? And so the policy part then is, so how do you then encourage the right feedstocks and the right processes to channel into the aviation sector where we don't have many other options for decarbonizing our fuel. So I'll leave it there for now, because I'll leave our policy expert maybe to.
That's a nice lob that you've set up for me, because obviously the next question or the next panelist is along those lines. And yes, again, you know, in the aviation sector, we've always talked about prioritizing the bio aspect of, you know, in Europe and in many other places where there's a huge market for these bio-based alternatives, but those don't exist here. And so, but there are lessons to be learned in terms of how do we prioritize policy-wise these types of things. And so, Sergio, can you tell us from the policy perspective, what, you know, I know that the Department of Energy is looking very closely at hydrogen, and how does that integrate into the overall energy picture for Abu Dhabi and for the UAE in general?
Yep. Thank you, Alejandro. We have been talking about hydrogen a lot during the last months and weeks. And regarding the hydrogen industry, we understand that hydrogen and CO2 sourcing could have implications for the location choice of future power to liquid plants. And I really believe that Abu Dhabi is well positioned to capture this opportunity and maybe become a leading player in a global market. As you said, Alejandro, we have to have a very holistic approach about hydrogen. I really think that in the midterm, blue hydrogen potential for those countries that have access to hydrogen production from natural gas and CCS at competitive prices is huge, and Abu Dhabi can benefit from this opportunity, and it may serve as a lever for the development of a low carbon hydrogen industry within the Emirate. And then this industry may migrate to the production of green hydrogen, because as you said, Abu Dhabi has very, very competitive PV production conditions. We have access to water, access to land. And as you have said before, we have the investment capital and business environment that is needed to engage in this green hydrogen and power to liquid production. But it's also true that there is always the intention to try to prioritize one sector over the other, and prioritization is something that depends on this national strategy that I said before, no? Understanding this strategy as a mechanism to put together all the pieces that Lourdes said in her intervention. And if we want to have a strategy neutral from the technological point of view, this prioritization doesn't make much sense. So it's true that feedstock used to produce SAF is a scarce resource, and we can understand that in the one hand, these feedstocks will be used on transport modes where they are needed the most in order to decarbonize, and in this case, prioritization is necessary. But as you know, prioritization is a kind of market distortion. And then the approach is not neutral from this technological point of view. So to shift feedstock to the aviation sector from the road sector, or from the heating sector, from the electricity generation sector, from the chemical sector, as Lourdes said, will have a policy cost, and it's not clear that will have a net climate benefit.
Absolutely right. And I guess that this is always the question, right? How much do you really want to intervene in a market, and how much do you want to, because it creates other effects, and maybe some of these effects may be perverse effects that may end up, you know, completely distorting a market in other industries. And so specifically in this particular case, because we're talking about something that really has an effect in very many industries around the economy here in the UAE. And so in the UAE and in general in the world. And so it's a very tricky subject, and specifically from a policy perspective. So let me go back and ask a question about sustainability Shannon. The aircraft operators are going to have to go out and buy certificates of emissions units on the market. And most of these will come from projects that are not in this region, at least for now. So can you help us understand how Emirates Airline is planning to approach this issue?
So we're talking about carbon offsets now, not
Correct.
SAF?
Yes,
Okay.
we're talking, and this is related to a question that we have received in the Q&A box, that the question is posed to Sergio, but I don't think that Sergio is really the right person. I'm not saying that you can't answer it, but it says, considering the timeline for CORSIA, is a policy being drafted or planned? And so CORSIA is a market-based measure that has been implemented by the International Civil Aviation Organization. And so, for example, Emirates Airlines, who is one of the aircraft operators in the UAE, will have to comply with CORSIA because the UAE has volunteered to participate in CORSIA since its pilot phase. And so with COVID-19 and everything else, there's a lot of questions out there as to whether or not you're going to be above your 2019 levels during the pilot phase of CORSIA in terms of emissions. But whenever you have to offset your emissions above your 2019 levels, how is Emirates Airline planning to go about this from a sustainability perspective, from the perspective of the airline in general?
Sure. So we've done a bit of work on this over the last couple of years, and some of the more important details on this had to wait until ICAO themselves had signed off on the sustainability criteria. So that's probably the first key thing. So that all of the carbon offsets that we procure have to meet the ICAO sustainability requirements, criteria. They have to be from the approved programs that that the ICAO Council has signed off. So start from that point. Now we've got until 2024 to surrender any offsets that we have to within the pilot phase. So you don't surrender every year. It's not like the EU ETS, for example, where you have to report, comply, and surrender emissions allowances every year. With CORSIA, once we're past the baseline years, then from 2021 to 2023, we report our emissions every year, but we don't have to true up our allowances. We don't have to, or offsets. We don't have to surrender the offsets that to meet our offsetting obligations until 2024. So that gives us a little bit more time to plan our strategy. And again, as far as strategy goes, there's several things we're going to be taken into account. As I mentioned, first of all, what do we actually have to procure? What are the requirements? If we don't use those, then the offsets wouldn't be eligible for compliance against CORSIA. So we have to meet those standards. And actually, I've seen too that some of the carbon offsetting providers out there, the marketplaces, trading companies, some of them are actually finding ways to mark or to label their carbon offsets as CORSIA compliant, which is actually probably a good service to for aircraft operators. So that's the first thing. Are they compliant? Secondly, is what kind of projects are we investing in? We might want to consider projects that have more of a sustainability story behind them rather than just pure industrial projects. Something that we feel more comfortable and confident about telling the story behind ourselves, and that our customers and our stakeholders can see the benefits. Certain types of projects will have social benefits as well as the pure carbon reduction benefits, and those social benefits can be of huge value to those communities that the projects are based in. And then we may want to consider as well, do we put together a portfolio of projects that are across our network where there's a direct connection to the communities that we're already serving? So, and of course, we're going to be considering the cost as well, but that goes without saying. And there's a broad range of prices of carbon offsets on the market as there are now. But putting all those factors together, then that will help us to develop our strategy and our portfolio.
Thank you very much, and I think that that's very reasonable. And as you are completely right, this is going to be an evolving story that we all need to be very, putting our attention on it so that we are able to understand how to best approach it. But I don't want to leave this question without asking Sergio, because it's sort of it's still, it lingers there in the sense of whether the Abu Dhabi government, in the case of the Department of Energy, or on a broader UAE perspective, are there any considerations in terms of how to handle carbon emissions and how to offset carbon emissions? Obviously, in the case of the aviation industry, but if not more generally, is there some sort of as in the European Union, any consideration for any sort of emissions trading scheme, or that is in line with complying with the Paris Accord, or anything along those lines?
Well, the fact is that I'm not aware that is an initiative here in the government regarding this issue. So
okay, so that answers the question very, very well. So let me go back quickly to a question for Lourdes this time. So, among the potential pathways that we have looked at and that are there, we have for sure the opportunity for lower carbon aviation fuels, or LCAFs. But in order to produce them, a significant number of investments must be made to reduce the carbon intensity of the conventional jet fuel produced here. So can you help us understand the technologies that come into play to accomplish this? And we had a slight intervention from Dr. El Hujaidi that works for Saudi Aramco last week, and he gave us a quick run through the technologies that are needed to reduce the carbon intensity of the conventional aviation fuel. But anything that you can add to that specifically?
Yeah, well, there is a combination, no? As you say, and by the way, every time I'm thinking about aviation, I'm thinking about the oil and gas industry for the SAF, because I'm gonna tell you why. I mean, this is not a competition. This is completely complementary. Exactly. Because all the experience that the oil and gas company have on producing fuels can be used to produce this SAF. So key technology behind most of the things we are talking about is catalysis. Mm-hmm. Okay. So reaction engineering and catalysis. This is the way in which we will produce the kerosene, the synthetic kerosenes we were talking about. This is the way in which we will remove the CO2 from the processes where we have. This is the way where we are going to produce hydrogen. So catalysis is really at the heart of the technologies. And we talk about having different technologies, but this one is common. And one of the industries with a huge experience in catalysis is oil and gas. So probably from Aramco, they talk about this. But essentially, we need to work on all the areas that will help us to decarbonize the society in general. So we need to have better energy efficiency. We need to capture the CO2 from wherever we have right now. So we were talking before about the experience that we have on producing hydrogen. So we produce hydrogen from methane reforming. This is a very efficient process, but it produces CO2. However, if we capture the CO2, now we have a source of CO2 and we have hydrogen. So a perfect combination to produce the same gas. It's not the green hydrogen, don't talk about the colors, but it's really very efficient. So and in the end, it doesn't emit the CO2 because you're capturing it. So that goes back to the whole life cycle assessment we have to do when we talk about sustainable fuels, because this is a very efficient energy system. So energy efficiency, reducing the CO2, avoiding to emit that into the atmosphere, reaction engineering that goes from the development of the catalyst to the optimization of the reactors. And then the final part, which is a conditioning this fuel to be delivered. So this, don't underestimate this, because this is also important. And the fuel has to be delivered, ready to be used. You know? So this is also part of the technologies that we need to have there. And then if you believe in this, and I firmly believe, by the way, then the investment will come. Because I think now the stars are aligned in the UAE. We have the low energy, We have a government that believes in things that in other places they think is impossible. We sent the Hope probe to Mars last month. So there are things that happen here that in other places, probably because they are more scared, because they have risk and loss, they don't want to do it. Here, the thoughts are different. So I think we are in a right place, that if we see the stability that Sergio was mentioning before, if we see that there is a sustained support on moving this, and we have to be very patient, this doesn't happen in 6 months. So then this is the place. I mean, the technologies are here. We still have to further develop them and integrate them, which is the key. But we can do it. We can do it, I think.
Thank you very much, Lourdes. And I think that all of these are very interesting points for business development, right? For trying to bring industry into this and looking at how we go about financing projects of this nature and establishing these partnerships that can be public-private partnerships or of some other way. But this leads to an interesting question for Manuel, which is we have seen that for large-scale energy investments, the UAE has created a very supportive environment. And when I say this is some of the explanations that John Hurst gave us last week. And so, this allows us to de-risk the participation of developers and of investors. And so, how do you think this is, and how important this is for the development of the SAF industry? And how, is there a way that you would recommend that we here in the UAE go about implementing this for SAF in the UAE? What do you see the role, for example, of Siemens to be in pushing this forward? And Siemens is a huge industrial player. You have many different markets, and you just mentioned you've just established a new division or a group of people that are going to be looking into this. So how do you see this, and what are the necessary conditions that need to be met for the industry to move forward?
In terms of the business environment in the UAE, I mean, this is for me one of the stars that's already aligned. The existing power infrastructure in Abu Dhabi, the gas-fired, is to a large degree built with Siemens technology under exactly this business model, where those were the IPPs. The partners are on board. I mean, with some of these partners, we're talking even now already looking into hydrogen, because it would be almost the same team. It would be just a slightly different task. So I think that goes in natural, and we know how to do that, and the developers know how to do that. And whether now this is a combined cycle plant or a PV plant, or may it be an electrolysis plant, that's a technical aspect that normally then the OEM has to cover. So now, what the OEM has to cover, especially under a PPP, is people want to see a performance guarantee from us. That's the first thing the developer asks. So now, what we like to do before giving a performance guarantee, we like to get an insurance. And now, this is a very interesting aspect. We go to an insurer and they ask us the following: how many years have you been running already? How many operating hours on this technology? Blah, blah, blah. You can imagine what's happening. So, and now it's getting interesting, because this our PEM, we are developing the PEM into industrial grade. First project came out 2011. 2015, 10 times bigger than the 2011 product. That's the current, our Catalysis 300 is 10 times bigger than our 2015 product. So we are in a product life cycle that is for the power industry. I mean, we have never seen that. The only reference I can make is a bit the status the wind industry was in the mid 2000s, where I remember from our colleagues in Denmark, when Siemens acquired the wind business in Denmark, they basically had a different generation of turbine in every single large project. So every single project was a different turbine technology. And you can imagine the problems that came along with that, But they had no choice. That's how it works. And I see the same coming for the electrolyzers. If we keep the pace, And we have to, because we are also asked to get the capex down. How do I do this? By pushing out one product generation after the other, without generating risks to our partners. So now, and I'm referring to a very specific discussion with a big insurance company, and the only way how we could convince them that they actually would be able to insure some of our Sea Licer 300 projects is because we were able to simulate the plant. So we could do it because we can digitalize the complete process chain, and we have simulation tools for our own product. So that's how we gain the credibility. Is this perfect? No, it's not. But it's the best we will get. And now, so that there is a whole aspect of simulation, digitalization, where we put a lot of emphasis on, because this will finally actually make the project bankable. Because this goes simulation, insurance, guarantees, financiers. So this is something that and then we are in the established business model, which worked perfectly in the UAE, and I have no doubt that we can pull this off again for the sake of SAFI or any other hydrogen application.
Okay, thank you very much, Manuel. This I think has a number of interesting aspects to it. But before we delve into those, I'd like to ask Sergio an interesting policy question in terms of, you've already addressed this somehow, but we have been mentioning and throughout the sessions in the webinar series, we have been discussing this idea of aviation is one of these hard to decarbonize sectors. And so, one of the technologies that have been explored and that are very promising is when Lourdes was mentioning this in terms of how we optimize the use of our current energy system and of our current waste streams. And so, one of the questions would be, should the government dictate a policy that prioritizes resource use and reuse toward hard to decarbonize sectors such as aviation? And so again, this goes back to the idea of recycling carbon, in essence. Should we attempt to do that, or how can we go about generating the conditions so that we are able to do that in the most effective way?
Yeah, thank you, Alejandro. I think that I have already answered more or less to this question before. No, I think it really depends on the strategy, and if this strategy wants to be neutral from the technological point of view or not. Because, as I said, prioritization is a kind of market distortion. So if the question is, we should support this market distortion in the region, I really believe that it depends on where do we want to be in the future and how this strategy want to be, which sector we want to prioritize. And I think that until now, it's not clear.
Yeah, I would agree with you to a certain degree. And I guess that one of the questions is that another way of putting it is the playing field in many of these aspects is sometimes considered as a level playing field or as a tilted playing field, right? And so most people would consider that the playing field in which we are now is already tilted. And goes back to this question of whether we should prioritize or use policy to level the playing field so that other industries can come into the mix. But again, it's a difficult question to answer, and I understand what you're saying. I fully agree with that. I guess we have a very interesting discussion here. I wanted to bring in one of the questions from the audience, and this is a technology-related question, which you already addressed in a way, Lourdes, but I don't know if you want to add something in terms of, what are the most promising feedstocks for sustainable hydrogen production in the UAE? If you have anything to say along those lines, please go ahead.
Yes, well, like in any other places, the feedstocks can vary, okay? But if we talk about the amount of feedstock that we need, that's where we have a problem in the UAE because of the size of the country, essentially, no? Mm-hmm. So there are places in which are working on using used oil from cooking. We don't have much here. There are some biomass. We don't have much here. We do have waste, but not enough to produce the amount that we need. So that's why we had all the discussion around hydrogen and CO2 as feedstocks for producing a syngas that can then be converted into the synthetic fuel that we need for aviation. So essentially, this is it. We can try to use, and by the way, maybe there are some feedstocks that are still for discovering. We don't know. But knowing the chemistry, because in the end, we have to go to the basics of science, no? So the fuel works because of the properties, of the physical properties it has.
But specifically for hydrogen, you know, where would we get the hydrogen from here in the UAE?
Okay, so the same. So for the hydrogen, we would have, say, maybe 3 main sources. We can have a biogas. We don't have much amount, but we can get it from biogas. We can get it from H2S splitting, so hydrogen sulfide splitting, because this is something we have in excess in our gas industry here. H2S is, the UAE is the country that exports more sulfur to the world, #1, okay? And that comes from H2S. So that's a possibility, although dealing with H2S has some safety issues, so it has to be done in a safe way and specific way, but it's a source of hydrogen, and we're working on this in Greece, for example. And the most widely used sources will be water splitting. Water splitting, again, so if you think of the UAE and you think of water, you think we don't have water, because we are thinking about drinking water. But if you think of the ocean, we have a lot of water. So we can try to use seawater to produce hydrogen. And then this will be the biggest source that we will have. I hope I answered your question now.
Yes, I think that was what the person that was asking that question was looking for, is exactly. We have a couple of other questions. The next one is for Shannon, and it says, what would be the favorable policy for airlines' commercial scale uptake of SAF, especially taking into account the price gap between SAF and conventional jet fuel and the COVID-19 pandemic that hit hard the financial performance of the airline industry? Do you have any comments on that, Shannon?
So I'd have to say I'm not a policy expert in this area. So it's an area there's a lot of work ongoing on. And in fact, even if you look at the EU situation at the moment, they're going through their policy setting process at the moment with Refuel EU program. And in fact, they're asking all the questions about what's the best way to promote the use and uptake of SAF in the EU. So perhaps there's going to be a lot of lessons that we can learn by following that process. I mean, one of the policy initiatives that Norway has already put in place, and which the EU and member states are looking at closely, is around mandates, so supply mandates. X% of your aviation fuel uptake has to be sustainable aviation fuel. I mean, that's something that possibly can work, but it also potentially comes with a lot of trade-offs and unintended consequences if the policy is not set up right. And it also has to be absolutely transparent process as well, so that all actors in the supply chain know what they have to deliver and know what they are collecting as well. And there's inevitably financial costs involved with those sorts of policies. So I don't have a simple answer for that one, unfortunately, but give me another couple of months of watching the developments in Europe, and I might be able to come back to you.
Yeah, I honestly agree with you. I don't think there is a simple answer to this, unfortunately, but thank you for that.
Can I ask a sorry?
Sure,
can I ask a quick question of Lourdes?
Of course.
Follow on from her comment about the supply of the water for electrolysis before. If you use seawater, does it have to be desalinated first, or can you use pure seawater?
Yeah, it's an excellent question, because that's the golden token that we will have. So of course, if you, depending on the electrolyzers that you have, you need to remove the salt first, and there will be desalination. That will be very expensive. No, I'm talking about catalysts and reactors that can handle seawater directly. So you have to design this. It has been done at the university level, and But of course, it has to be scaled up. There are things we still need to do, but this is a technology that can happen. So you can design a dual catalyst, for example, in which you handle on the one hand the chlorine and on the other the hydrogen production. So that's doable. And I think it has to be worked a lot. We are trying to work on this in the RIT Center, but it could really be a solution for us, because every time I was thinking about hydrogen before produced from water, I was thinking exactly what you say. Do I have to desalinate the water? And is this the best approach? But no, I think we can work on one shot, having a reactor that can do the that can do the production of hydrogen from seawater directly. Then you have to work on the corrosion, of course. So there are issues there, but it's doable.
Yeah, and this was what I was saying, and this is exactly the point why within SAFI-UAE we need an R&D arm, right? Yeah. We need someone that looks at the low TRLs, at the low technology readiness level, because if we ask, Lourdes, what is the TRL of hydrogen production from salt water, it's probably on the very low end of that scale from 1 to 10, right? But if we ask Manuel, what is the TRL of hydrogen production from the technology that you installed in Dubai, it's probably 10, right? It's already there, it's commercial, it's ready to go. And there's everything in between. So this is the interesting part, and this is why within SAFI, we need to really look at all of these different aspects or all of these different pillars, right? Of our capacity to produce sustainable aviation fuels. We're running short on time, and I realize that some of you have other things to do after this session, and so I don't want to run overtime, particularly in this particular session. And so I'd like to ask one last question to all of you. And in that, it's along the lines of, what does each of you see what is the future for sustainable aviation fuels in the UAE from each of your perspectives? We had a very good discussion. Clearly we could be discussing this for the next 5 hours, and we would never end with a clear conclusion. But just to close and to make sure that we have a good way of closing the session, if each of you can give me your vision for what it will take to establish a sustainable aviation fuel industry in the UAE, and what are the importance of each of these pillars that we have put in our proposal. And obviously each of you is an expert in each of them. And so perhaps we can start from the technology point of view, Lourdes, and perhaps you can start us off with your closing thoughts on the future of sustainable aviation fuel in the UAE.
Thank you. I will summarize actually some of the ideas I have been saying before. I really believe this is a place to develop sustainable aviation fuels because of the synergies that we have, the low energy cost, the experience from the oil and gas industry, the aviation, one of the sectors that is leading the economy of the country, and the belief of the country itself on doing things that others don't do. So if we combine all this, all we need now is investment. So in addition, we need believers with money. so that we can put all the stars align and get it there. But I really believe this is a place in which we can develop SAF, for sure.
Thank you very much, Lourdes. Perhaps Shannon, if you can tell us your views.
And that the technology plays a key role in this development, of course.
That was the R&D piece. Sorry, that was the R&D piece. Go ahead, Shannon. Sorry.
I personally think the prospects are very bright for a SAF industry here. And the key will be exactly what you're doing now, is bringing together all of the stakeholders, all of the players and the entire value chain to come together, assess what the options are, identify the best way forward, and then to put together both the policy and the business case to develop the whole supply chain here.
Okay, thank you very much, Shannon. Sergio?
Yeah, thank you. I support Shannon's point of view. We have to work together just to try to set a strategy. But my point is that I think that COVID-19 crisis is a huge opportunity for shape the aviation sector and to make it fit better with the low carbon future that we all need and we all want. And SAF looks like a promising industry where innovation can play a very important role. And in this region, the industry, sustained by the base of a robust domestic demand and competitive prices in a global environment, I think that it really has a huge potential and can act as a vector of economic growth in the region.
Thank you very much, Sergio. And Manuel, what is your view?
I completely agree. And I mean, building on the synergies, as Lourdes said, I believe there is even a risk of not doing it. If we see the endeavor and also the struggle that the UAE economy has gone through in the last 20 years, trying to diversify and build up also alternative industries to taking hydrocarbons out of the ground, this is it. This is it. This is what connects the remaining dots, builds on all the strengths and also the activities that have been done in between by ramping up an aviation industry. So there is a domestic aspect where I would say it's risky not to do it. And then there is the opportunity to have it as a product beyond the UAE and actually exporting sustainable aviation fuels from the UAE, and that's a tremendous opportunity.
Well, I guess that is a nice way to have food for thought for the future. We all, I think, we are in agreement that we are in a very interesting crossroads here. That we all agree that there's a big opportunity. We all agree that there are very specific elements that make the UAE an incredible place in a place where this can happen. And so, as I mentioned when we started this session, this will be the last of our weekly sessions. We had planned for an 8th session that we had hoped when we started this process that we would be able to do it in person, but that clearly is not going to happen. And so we will have an 8th session with an implementation plan for how we can go about launching the Sustainable Aviation Fuels Initiative for the UAE. I want to thank all of our panelists for today. Obviously, Lourdes, thank you very much for your support. I know you had to move and shift things around for you to come in and help us out. Shannon, thank you very much for also your availability and your support throughout all this process. Sergio, thank you very much for your participation. And Manuel, thank you very much. I thank all of you, and I also would like to thank the sponsors of the series that we have had from the beginning. We have obviously Etihad Airways, who has been with us from the start, the General Civil Aviation Authority of the UAE, the Boeing Company, the International Air Transport Association, Emirates Airline, and of course, Masdar, or Abu Dhabi Future Energy Company. With that, again, thank you all. Thank you very much for your support.